I've just been listening to the tail end of an address being given to those who attended the breakfast. And a couple of the points that came clearly through to me were the lack of investment in matters agricultural in Australia. But more importantly, I think, is the lack of direction for agriculture in Australia. So when we talk about mental health, I have no doubt that one of the contributing factors is for many people who are involved today, they don't know, in fact, the priority that government gives to agriculture. You can hear individuals make the right noises, say the right words from time to time, but the reality is this country doesn't have a national water policy, which is terribly important both to the human beings. It doesn't have a national water policy, which is important for the quality of our land, and separately it doesn't have a national agricultural policy. And I've been arguing from as long as 1996 with John Howard before he was elected. I've done it with Kevin Rudd and I did it with Malcolm Turnbull, that we need both of those policies that have got to be generational. By that I mean 100 years. And secondly, they should be bipartisan because governments are going to obviously change over that period of time. And while we did things in Victoria to try and stimulate the agricultural industry in Victoria, particularly just south of the river, the reality is we are, by our location, the anchor point of the most exciting sector in the world. So you have the Americas, you have Europe, and then you have Asia. And as you know as well as I do, there's 4 billion people to our north, growing quickly, and most of those countries are net importers of food, and yet the reality is New Zealand and Israel have a better reputation for supplying products into those countries than we do. And it breaks my heart to think that when you listen to a budget like the other night, which has a focus on increasing tax to reduce debt, there is no focus in real terms on growth. And the area where there should be growth for the next 100 years and beyond is in agriculture. And it should be there because we should have a KPI of feeding 500 million people or 1 billion people by 2050. As it is, you work, you come up with ideas, you produce, you try and market, but there is no overall picture that puts a stake in the ground for Australia, for agriculture generally. And to me, it is a great shame for 2 or 3 reasons. One, the revenue it raises, obviously, but secondly, the employment opportunities it offers. Even though techniques and scale is important, if you had as a KPI for Australia to be able to feed, whether it's veggies or whether it's other products, 500 million people, 1 billion people by 2050, you'd have to have people who are scientifically trained, you'd have to have people who are semi-skilled, and you'd have to have people that are unskilled. And a lot of you will understand, coming from rural areas of Australia, in many of your communities, youth unemployment is high and getting higher. They have no occupation, they are becoming bored, they're getting seduced by drugs, etc., and many then are getting themselves into more serious problems. So while agriculture isn't the answer to all of the challenges facing Australia, there is no doubt in my mind that we have missed the boat over the last 50 years through lack of direction and leadership. And while we still have the opportunity, the question is, where is the indication that government is going to give agriculture and water the priority it deserves? So we hear about the new technological age and everything else, but by God, we forget about the fundamentals that are actually going to employ the community of the country. That's not why I was here, asked to come and speak to you this morning, but I do think it is a contributing factor, because in my work now, and although I'm leaving Beyond Blue on June the 30th, having established it in 2000, I'm increasingly concerned about the mental health of our community, our young, very much concerned about the mental health of our regional and rural communities, and of course, as many of you will know, as a cohort, the cohort most at risk for suicide is men over 85. Now, that's because there's less of them, but sadly more as a percentage are taking their lives. And so my path over the last 17 years, having gone into this with no knowledge at all, has been to find myself now a well-educated layperson, but not professional. And I've learnt a lot of things over that period of time which I never expected to learn. And so I feel a bit selfish that perhaps one of the biggest beneficiaries of Beyond Blue has been my own education. And I guess I just want to leave you with a couple of thoughts today, which my colleagues are going to follow up shortly and talk about their experiences and make their contribution and take questions from you. The first thing I've learnt is most of us have become very complacent with life itself, partly because really since the Second World War, Australia has never been challenged in any way, economically or physically. So by way of example, I wonder how many of you this morning when you woke up gave thanks for waking up? Anyone? That's, apart from myself, that's not an unusual reaction I get from audiences regardless of size. But just think about it for a moment. What does it tell you about yourself? That perhaps you're very complacent about the most important gift we have, which is the gift of life itself. We take it for granted. We just assume we're going on. And yet we all know that is not the case, but that's how we've lived our lives. What's important about the gift of life is that it gives you a rock against which to judge the things that during the day cause you stress or anxiety or worse. So my second question to you would be, I wonder how many of you have a discipline, a mechanism for dealing with stress and anxiety? And I guess the answer would be the same. Every night before I go to sleep, for a moment of a second, I will think about the day I've just lived, and I'll wash out the things that I've done reasonably well, and I'll focus on the things that I've done less well or badly. And I'll ask myself, what could I have done to have avoided this? What do I have to do tomorrow to make sure that I can correct the mistakes that I made during the day? And that enables me to prioritise things that might actually be eating away with me, but when I compare it with my gift of life, my rock, in one sense seem immaterial. So a few years ago, by way of example, I lost an election. On my scale, 1 to 10, rock being 0, that was only a 1 or 1.5. I must admit I was a bit surprised at the result, but in real terms it was part of the natural order of things. No one had been hurt, and I was going to wake up the next day. So I only rated that at the time a 1 or 1.5. Well, recently my parents have died separately, a couple of years apart, in their mid-80s. They've lived good lives. Of course, sad to see them go. They weren't ill for long. None of their children had predeceased them. They'd lived a good life. Against my rock, that's only a 1 or a 2. If I make a mistake, any of my businesses, it might have a higher ranking. But again, against the gift of life, it's almost immaterial. So many of you in this room will therefore go to bed at night with something that causes you stress or anxiety. You won't address it. You'll toss and turn during the night, and you'll wake up in the morning as though you haven't slept at all. Regardless of whether you sleep for 4 hours or 8 hours, makes no difference. And if you're not careful, that stress, that anxiety will continue to eat away until you actually become physically and mentally ill. And for many, that leads then to death. So going back to my point, if I may, the most important thing you can do in terms of dealing and avoiding mental health issues is make sure you have a discipline that allows you to deal with stress and anxiety. And I think that starts with this concept of a gift of life. And I don't mean that in a religious sense. I don't care whether you say thank you to someone up there, down there, in the dog kennel, the person you're sleeping with at the time, makes no difference. But you've got to have a discipline for dealing with the things that upset you. So tomorrow morning when you wake up, I'd be very disappointed if some of you at least didn't say, well, thank you, I'm glad to be alive, I've got another 24 hours. And secondly, think about the other end of the day of dealing with the issues that cause you anxiety and stress. The next thing I want to impart with you in my brief time is to convey that if you'd asked me a few years ago what the most important thing in my life was, I would have said my wife and my children. If you ask me today, I say my own condition. And I don't say that selfishly, but I've come to realise that I can't discharge my responsibilities to my family, to the businesses I run, to Beyond Blue, to football clubs, unless I am in good health. And that means I've got to be careful of what I eat and drink, and you don't do anything to excess. It's not to say you don't have heavier nights than others, but you will. But you understand the importance of actually making sure your condition is as good as you can make it. That will, in many cases, ward off a lot of illnesses. It won't ward them all off. And in mental health, you could go to bed tonight, having been, as I have, well all my life. I've never experienced emotional or clinical depression, but overnight I might have a chemical shift in my brain and I wake up tomorrow morning in a cosmatose position, very, very ill. I'm well enough educated now, hopefully, that if that were to happen, I'd know what to do and to reach out and get professional help. But importantly, I do know that it is important for me in discharging my responsibilities to be in as good a condition as possible, and if I make a genuine effort consistently to do that, I'm going to ward off a lot of those other illness and ailments that we face as we progress through life. So if you take those three issues, gift of life, a rock, and then the issue of your own condition, and you put the three of them together, and you were to live by those so-called guidelines or rules, what benefit might that have elsewhere? And I want to say to you, it will have tremendous benefits for those you're responsible for directly, your family, your children, those you employ, those you work with, those in community. For those of you who, like me, have children and grandchildren, you can't tell them anything these days. They're all brighter than I am, and if I try to tell them anything, they're just as likely to do the opposite. But the one thing that does make a difference is when you live a lifestyle that, through example, they see value in and they emulate. So that if you appreciate waking up every morning and you share that knowledge with your children, and if you then have a discipline for dealing with stress and anxiety and share that with your children, it's likely that they're going to do it for the rest of their life. And if you then live a good, healthy life, then they're likely to do so as well. There's one other component which I think becomes terribly important in this day and age, and that is how you use your so-called technology, your mobile devices, your Facebook, your Twitter, all of these other bloody things that exist in life today. Because I tell you what, they are killing people, and they're killing young people in particular, who use them to share knowledge to either deliberately or inadvertently cause harm to others. So by way of example, none of us should take a mobile phone to our bedrooms at night. We leave it on the kitchen table in a bowl, and you encourage your children to do the same. Because I can't tell you the number of people I know, men in particular, who have been in senior positions who have taken their mobile phone to bed with them at night. The phone rings 2 or 3 times, they get no sleep, and their condition starts to really quickly deteriorate. So there's a lot of things that we can do for our own lives, but then there's a lot of things we can do that will influence the lives of those we're more directly responsible for. And it's terribly important we do, because there is no doubt we live in a very challenging world at the moment. And the greatest regret, as I stand down from Beyond Blue, is that the suicide rate is still so unacceptably high, being double the road toll. And so every day, 8 Australians take their lives. 8 Australians. What an extraordinary waste. But more importantly and more sadly is those they leave behind, who invariably measure more than one It could be a large family, it could be a community, it could be a police force. I've just flown over here this morning and I was talking with a gentleman as we were coming off the plane, and he was talking to me about Beyond Blue and his wife and everything else, and one of the stewardesses on the plane was helping a lady up the walkway, and she said, yes, we've just had 2 suicides here at Qantas, which I knew about, a stewardess and a cabin supervisor. So everywhere, regardless of age, people are believing that they're going to be better off, or their families are going to be better off if they exit. And of course that is never the case, because the families are then left with the pain and wondering why, particularly when it's men who haven't in any way displayed any signs that they're going to take this action. So I guess what I'm saying in part is, while we think it's up to governments to provide the answers to the increasing expectations that we place on ourselves, that are placed on us, whether you're farmers or whether you're a football player or a musician or a person in industry, the reality is we have got to accept responsibility for our own health. If we wait for governments to do it, we'll be waiting a long time, and the truth is they'll probably mess it up. So much of what you're going to hear in a few moments about examples, about issues, about responses, really is increasingly coming back to ourselves. I have now 7 little Australians, 7 grandchildren, and the youngest of those will probably live to 100 years of age. That is, for us, might be seen as a long life, but in years to come it'll be a shorter life. And therefore the reality is, how do you then occupy yourselves for the length of life that you're going to be granted? So the other day I was doing an interview in a Channel 7 in Melbourne, and we're getting the news that Prince Philip has decided to reduce his outings from August this year. And a couple of the guys were sniggering, and I asked them their ages, and one was 34 and the other was 42 or something, and I said, well, you just think this gentleman's 97 years of age, he's been on the go for that period of time, you've got another 40 years of life, or another 50. What are you going to do with your time? How are you going to fill it? Because occupation is so important. Not necessarily working all the time for $1, maybe some of the week playing sport, maybe some of the week gardening, some of the week looking after grandchildren. It is so important to be mentally and physically active all of your life. A, to ward off some illnesses, but also to remain relevant to your community. How often have I gone out, not that I do it too much these days, and you ask what I would describe as a senior person, because this word old is not a word that I relate to. As we pass through life, we become more experienced. We don't become old, we just become more experienced. But how often do you ask a person who is obviously more experienced, how are you? And then sadly they tell you. It's the most silly, stupid question to ask a senior person, because then you'll find out invariably it's about their pureed food that they've got to eat, or their urinary tract problems that they might be having. And you notice with the passage of time, if people aren't active, then their knowledge, their focus narrows. They're not as worldly. They can't talk about things that's happening in the country or this community or the nation or the world. It's all about themselves. And that is a very clear sign that those people have given up living and they're just waiting until they're removed to another place. Again, it goes back to good health practices, being active mentally and physically every day. So when you go to bed at night, you're tired and you then sleep well. I talked about a few moments ago about expectations. We're seeing a lot more of our sportsmen and women, for instance, putting their hands up to suffering some or one of many mental illnesses. Expectations that have been put on them early, they've shown promise, they may get picked up for a sport or a code, then they're put into a cocoon, training all the time. At the end of that, they're put back into the community, their peer group has moved on, their income has stopped, and they're right back where they started 10 or 15 years ago. It is very, very sad that our system today allows these young athletes to have to give so much time to training. There is no time for them to do much personal development through education, etc. And so therefore, and I notice it in Australian rules football, so many of them, when they get downtime, turn their phones on and they start gambling on the races. Not only do they place bets on their phone, but they can watch the event, and then they move from Adelaide to an event up in Queensland, an event in Brisbane. Sometimes they'll go over to New Zealand. So we've got a whole cohort of young athletes now who are now increasingly reliant on gambling. And if that wasn't bad enough, we have all this sports betting that we're seeing all the time on television, listen to on radio and see in the press. That is going to present us with so many social issues as time marches on that we won't be able to handle them. To think that we're educating children to believe that their future and their happiness is a result of gambling is one of the most antisocial, unacceptable community activities of our day. And in all of this, you and your colleagues, in whatever form of farming they may be pursuing, get up early in the morning, you go out, you do your work. Many of the things that I've talked about in one sense don't relate to your particular industry. On the other hand, to some extent they do. And yet you're in an industry, as I said earlier, that to me, in one sense, is not of leadership. There is no leadership that gives agriculture the recognition it deserves. And therefore you can't contribute in a way that you can at least see a vision as to where we want to be. If you started with the sort of vision I was talking about earlier, in terms of thinking about 2050, and you work back as how to get to 2050, you might change a lot of your practices. You might change a lot of the way in which you use your land. One of the things that upsets me so much is we have no idea in real terms about the changing eating habits of those who live to our north. We should have large teams of people always in China, in India, in Indonesia, on our doorstep, watching, listening, tasting the change in demand for food so that we could supply it. I remember on my last trip to Israel watching grapes getting packed, and there were only 6 grapes on the vine in each little unit. And all the grapes were about the same size. And they were fresh, and they were going to be in hotel rooms in Japan the next day. And I thought, God, how can you make money from this? But people pay for quality, particularly when they know what it is that their customers are going to provide. So when we talk about mental health, and when you hear about the specifics that are going to follow me today, please understand, yes, some mental health issues cannot be avoided. They are changes. Some are born with mental health problems. But in most cases, early detection, early responses can remove that burr from under your saddle forever. More serious forms of mental illness, schizophrenia, bipolar, can never be cured. But with the correct medications, you can live a very, very full life. And so therefore, by way of example there, a few years ago I was down in Tasmania with the board of the Hawthorn Football Club up near Cradle Mountain, and the now departed Trade Minister, Andrew Robb, rang me up, and I think most of you will have heard of Andrew Robb. He had just stood down from the Shadow Cabinet, and he rang me up and said, look, I've got a problem, I've had it for a number of years, I want to talk to you. And I couldn't take it because of bad reception. When I got back to my hotel room, I rang him. And I asked him to explain his illness. And Andrew said to me, for the last 30 years, more and more of my day is becoming unusable. It's now got to the stage where I can't participate in anything till after noon, after lunchtime. Half of my day is lost by this black cloud that just sucks me up. And what I do, as I've done for him and many other people, I try and understand what his condition is. I then ring up a senior psychiatrist in Melbourne and say, well, do you know of an individual who deals in what I've tried to describe? And he told me of a professor, so I sent Andrew to him. They experimented with drugs initially. It didn't work, the first lot of drugs. The second lot did. And he was able to then fully recover, go back into the ministry, which he did for the next 3-4 years, and then, of course, now he's back in the private sector. But can you imagine allowing yourself to be ill for 30 years before you sought help? And that's the saddest thing. So many people today still refuse to seek help. And in the main, they're men. And farmers are worse than the metropolitan males. A, lack of access. The other, that they're born to be tougher than John Wayne, and so until you've had the tractor roll over you, rip your arms off and your legs, and you crawl into the doctors carrying 4 components and blood everywhere, only at that stage do you think you have a reason to go and seek help. There was a small country town in Victoria, not far from the city, where there were 4 suicides in a month. 3 farmers and the son of one of the farmer, who was so upset he dressed in black and went and lay on the freeway until a truck ran over him. Now, can you imagine the damage that did to that community? The policeman who had to attend those 4 suicides had a breakdown. So we've got to understand we've got to seek help, and communities have got to seek help. AUSVEG has got to have a program that continually talks about your mental health. It is up here in terms of a priority. It's not an afterthought. But at the end of the day, it is about how we approach our lives, what responsibility we take for ourselves, and then, of course, how we provide the leadership to those we have responsibility for. To those of you who leave here, I strongly recommend you have a look at the Beyond Blue website, which is www.beyondblue.org.au. That will tell you a great deal about the illness. It allows you to actually feed in some information, which will print out a response that will tell you some of the things you might be doing. The most important thing is to educate yourself about issues surrounding mental health while you're healthy, because then when things change, you might recognise the sign in yourself, or you might recognise the sign in someone else and be able to assist them to a better place. As I said, we're not going to be able to cure and ward off every form of mental illness. But where we can't, there are steps we can take to ensure that we live a very, very full and productive life, and hopefully a very long life. So I guess my message today is to ask you to think about what you are doing to securing your own place in the sun. Forget your business for a moment, think about yourself. Have you become so complacent with living that you just take life for granted? And if so, I'd like to suggest that's wrong. Do you have a mechanism for dealing with the things that cause you stress and anxiety? And if you don't, I'd like you to think about adopting one. Do you believe that you are in a good place mentally and physically? And if you aren't in a good place mentally and physically, you owe it to yourself and you owe it to others to get there. And lastly, I'd like to reinforce this concept I mentioned before about being fully occupied for the whole of your life. To me, retirement equates with death. If you want to die early, just retire and just sit there and the Grim Reaper will come down and pick you up and take you away. But life is so exciting. You know, we used to think about years ago, I remember well when television first came to Australia in '56, I used to think about the introduction of the automobile and planes as great innovations, and since then, of course, computers, mobile phones, you name it, etc. But the rate of change, the speed of change, is faster today than it ever has been. And it's going to get faster, which in one sense is frightening. On the other hand, it is challenging. And one of the things we've got to deal with is change and the speed of change. To stand still is to go backwards in business or in life. To actually get the most out of living, we've got to ourselves accept responsibility for much of what the outcome may be. not government, not the industry you're part of, but our own contribution. And in doing that, the important thing is to get the balance right. We're only here once, you've got to have fun. So whether it's having fun with friends, yourself, your football club, who cares, doesn't matter, but it's not all about working 24/7. You've got to have the break. There's no point being picked up by the Grim Reaper if you haven't enjoyed living. So I leave that with you for your thoughts. You'll find the guys who are going to follow me will give you some very important pointers as well. I wish you well in your industry and in your farms and your production. I just wish we had a government that appreciated the potential of agriculture. Thank you.
Here. Thank you, Jeff Kennett. Thank you very much.